What were the major conflicts at the Philadelphia Convention? And how were they resolved? What arguments can you make for and against giving each state the right to send the same number of members to the Senate? What arguments can you make for and against including the Three-Fifths Clause and the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution? When you are ready, you may begin.
As Thomas Jefferson wrote in a 1787 letter to John Adams, the Philadelphia Convention was an assembly of demigods. Some of the greatest political minds in the world met in 1787 as 55 delegates to amend the Articles of Confederation. However, the result of the convention was the creation of the Constitution of the United States of America. The major conflicts of the convention were distribution of governmental powers between the states and the national government, legislative representation, and voter representation.
Powers between the federal and state governments can be easily paralleled with the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debates at the Philadelphia Convention. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was a near non-existent central government, and this is exemplified in Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation, which states that each state retains sovereignty, freedom, and independence. This anti-federalist fear of a strong central government rooted itself in experience under British rule and the fear of a loss of state power to that of federal power. The anti-federalist fear also helped establish the Bill of Rights and a checked executive branch under the Constitution.
However, the Federalists at the convention pushed for a stronger central government than that was what was established under the Articles of Confederation. Shays' Rebellion helped the Federalist argument of a needed stronger central government when the national government was unable to help Massachusetts put down a farmer insurrection. As stated in Federalist No. 9 by Alexander Hamilton, a firm union will be of the utmost moment to the peace and liberty of the states, as a barrier against domestic faction and insurrection. Ultimately, within the Constitution, the Federalists won the debate over state versus federal power, with establishment of such federal powers as centralized military, centralized tax, regulation of interstate commerce, and the Supremacy Clause establishing the Constitution as the higher law of the country.
Primarily, delegates to the convention argued over equal legislative representation in the developing federal government. If representation was based on population, as outlined in James Madison's Virginia Plan, then states with more people would have an unfair amount of influence compared to states with fewer people. However, if representation went according to William Patterson's New Jersey Plan, which was to continue the equal representation under the Articles of Confederation, then smaller population states would have more power because they would have equal representation for fewer citizens.
Additionally, Alexander Hamilton proposed the New York Plan, a system which included a bicameral legislature, an assembly and senate, executive governor with life-term judiciary, nationally appointed state governors, and national veto power over state legislation. None of these plans were acceptable to both sides, so the convention appointed a special committee to create a compromise. This committee, headed by Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth, came up with a great compromise. The Great Compromise can be found articulated in the Constitution, its main points being the House of Representatives is made up of proportional representation and the Senate is based on equal representation. The drawback to offering small states equal representation in the Senate is that it creates the possibility of an influential minority.
With the power granted to the Senate in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the Constitution to advise presidential appointments, senators of small states would have proportionally more say in foreign ambassadors, judicial appointments, and other public ministers than the representatives of large states would have. The multitudes of people who live in New York get the same Senate representation as the much fewer number of people who live in Rhode Island. However, representation based on population alone wouldn't have worked either, because the states with more people would have been able to overpower the states with fewer people. Equal representation in the Senate is ultimately acceptable and fair because it balances the House of Representatives. Additionally, the ability of people to directly elect both their representatives and senators, which was passed with the 17th Amendment, prevents senators from pursuing faction interests because they are more inclined to maintain the people's trust in order to be reelected.
The argument over slavery also created much tension at the Philadelphia Convention. The issue was whether or not slaves were considered property or humans. The southern states wanted to count slaves as people for more representation in Congress. The northern states felt that the South's desire weren't in conjunction with their views on slavery. Massachusetts delegate Elbridge Gerry pointed out that as slaves were considered property in the South, then his cattle and horses should be represented as well.
The result of this argument was the Three-Fifths Clause, as proposed by James Wilson within the Constitution, which is found in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. The Fugitive Slave Clause in Article 4, Section 2 was also established to please the South and impose regulations on escaped slaves. Although compromises were made on the issue of slavery, no definitive decision on the issue would be made until the post-Civil War era with the creation of the 13th Amendment.
Benjamin Franklin stated of the ratification of the Constitution that there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I am sure I shall never approve them. I doubt too whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution. Issues such as slavery and representation brought upon heated debate, yet eventually ended in compromise where neither sides of the debate were satisfied. Compromise ultimately was the underlying theme of the Philadelphia Convention, and because it led to the creation of the Constitution. Thank you.
Historian Charles Beard once said that economic interest was the driving force at the convention, or the reason for the convention, the reason for the problems between the House of Representatives and the Senate, the problems between the 3/5 compromise and the fugitive slave clause. Would you guys agree or disagree with historian Charles Beard?
I'd agree, because the main issues concerning slavery were economic, because slaves were desired in the South because of their economic gain and the possibilities of growing cotton and other products.
I would agree as well, because if you look at the professions that many of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists held, the Federalists tended to be in more educated jobs like lawyers, and Anti-Federalists were more involved in agriculture, so that drove their economic interests as well.
I would disagree based on the rule on, based on their experience under British rule. They had a genuine fear of a central government that would impose on their rights as opposed to economic interests. So I think they had a genuine fear that their rights would be imposed upon by the federal government.
Patrick Henry was quoted saying that I smell a rat when the Philadelphia Convention was created. What rat did he smell? And was he right?
He smells Alexander Hamilton because he feared the people at the convention would create a strong national government that would be tyrannical.
Also, he just was suspicious of the convention as a whole, because it was a select group of people. And granted, the Constitution would eventually go out to ratification by state legislatures, but he was just wary of a small number of people creating a new government.
Furthering that, the convention was originally supposed to amend the Articles of Confederation, when in reality they ended up creating a whole new constitution. So I probably felt that they were doing stuff that they didn't potentially mean to do.
How do the rules established at the convention itself lead to the compromises you guys talked about in your testimony, as well as to the idea of civil discourse in general?
I think the rules helped them so it wouldn't erupt in chaos. They had to kind of form committees and come up with plans before they presented their ideas. So both sides came up with the New Jersey and the Virginia plan, and that's kind of what came along as the civil discourse, so they could create argument rather than just arguing over what plan should eventually come about.
Also, the rule of silence helped them keep the ideas inside the convention and kept the public opinion from swaying how the Constitution was written.
What do you mean by silence?
They could not publicize what they were saying, and they couldn't talk about what was going on in the convention to other people.
Was the Constitution, or is the Constitution, this was, a pro or anti-slavery document that was ratified? In other words, who would have come away saying we won? Pro-slavery advocates or anti-slavery advocates?
After the ratification of the Constitution, the proponents of slavery would say they won because the clauses that talk about slavery within the Constitution were made as compromises for ratification of the Constitution from the North, so that the South would help ratify the Constitution. So the Southern delegates probably definitely won in that argument.
To disagree with my colleague, I think the anti-slavery advocates would have for sure come away feeling like they won, because they included a clause in the Constitution that set slavery to end in 1808. They thought it was
What
going
kind
to
of
be.
slavery?
I'm sorry.
What kind of slavery?
International slavery. But they thought it would be an obsolete trade by that point. So, in context of that argument and that mindset, I think anti-slavery advocates would have thought they'd won.
The northern states also didn't specifically address the institution of slavery, they just addressed the representation of slaves within the 3/5 slave clause and the fugitive slave clause. So that kind of set the precedent for the eventual ending of slavery.
Stop there on time. 435 with testimony.
Yeah, that was a long one.
And Austin and Anna, there are periods and commas for reasons. You need to use them.
I know. We knew this was long, so we wanted to
You sped through it like nobody's business. And then Anna in your reading and Lila in your cross-ex, you both finished like,
Okay.
okay? Finish how you start. Alright, if you're gonna finish, I mean, leave the judges with what you just said so they can move on to the next one and not just kind of pay it off. And hope the next person pick it up nice and loud. Alright? You did, Lila, you presented very well in your testimony, but your cross-ex, you kind of always finished on a downward trend. You finished strong in your cross-ex, but all your transitions were
Okay.
I know you're long, but you guys still need to put some more or more apparent against equal protection in the Senate. I just don't think it's strong enough. I think you only have 1 point.
The quote, or
What is read your section again? Why? Where is it? What arguments can you make for and against giving each state the right to send the same number?
The drawback to offering small states equal representation.
Yeah, read it.
Okay. The drawback to offering small states equal representation in the Senate is that it creates the possibility of an influential minority.
That's it, and that's the only thing you guys have.
Yeah.
That's the question specific for and against.
Right.
You need more against. Because, and that happens every year. And to separate yourselves, while testimonies are not completely going to separate you, having a strong emphasis to the negative in this question is really important to set you apart. Because so many times in so many classes, and every year, always take the for, but very rare spend or emphasize the against. And that is a very important aspect of what this question is asking. Okay? I think you can limit some of the wording within your first testimony, talk about the conflicts, kind of eliminate some of the commentary you have on the conflicts that took place, and kind of get to the point so you can spend some time with or include the Senate and the 3/5 and fugitive slave clause as part of those conflicts, instead of spending so much time in the New Jersey plan and those things, and kind of get to it just a little bit faster. All right, cross-ex. What, and we're gonna get to this on Thursday, but what is the driving force to get to the Philadelphia Convention? What event finally goes, we got, there's a big problem.
Shays Rebellion.
Shays Rebellion. Is Shays Rebellion, the rebellion itself, not the reasons behind the rebellion, but is the rebellion itself economic? No. It's about putting down instability within inside the country. So you want to argue whether or not it was economic or not. Shays Rebellion, the rebellion itself is not economic. The reason for their rebellion is economic. Taxation, paying of taxes, enforcement of things. So you can talk about it in that way. I liked your argument about slavery and the fact that slavery is economic. Austin, you disagreed. And what example did you use? I'll use the British constitutional system, right?
Yes.
And then Anna, what point did you bring
There were what?
for economic? If the Constitution was economic.
That, this was kind of a reach, I realized, but that the Federalists were more.
Okay.
They
Remember,
differed in their.
at the Constitutional Convention, we don't have Federalists and Anti-Federalists.
Okay.
They don't exist yet. They don't exist until September of 1787. After the Constitution has already been created, do Federalists and Anti-Federalists exist? You have pro-Articles of Confederation and pro-stronger government people, but they don't have any labels.
So
At this
should we
point.
label them not as, like when you're talking about people at the convention, should you not label them as?
Because George Mason ends up becoming an Anti-Federalist, and he was at the
Right.
Philadelphia Convention.
So like, in our testimony, when you talk about like the debates at the Philadelphia Convention, you don't want to label them as anti-federalist, anti-federalist?
No.
So we
Okay.
could just say like proponents of.
Proponents of, yeah. They're all, for the most part, in favor of a stronger national government. Mason doesn't like it because there's no Bill of Rights, so he leaves. New York doesn't like it because they're going to lose a lot of power. Rhode Island doesn't like it because it's Rhode Island. Okay? So that economic question, there's a professor at UNR who is one of the best professors I've ever had, and he sits down for his constitution, his political science class on the Constitution, goes, the Constitution's a socialist document, prove me wrong. And that's his first question when he sits down in class. It's very much about economics. And not only economics, but making sure there's an equal playing field, or more equal playing field in economics. And while there's points you could argue against him, it's hard not to. So just something to keep in mind that it very much is setting a equality factor throughout it for economics, all right? The rat, I like humor, and that's a good way to answer it. You know, saying Alexander Hamilton was there, but then saying more specifically why Hamilton. Okay, what is it about Hamilton that he didn't like that made him think the smell of the rat was Hamilton? Okay, you guys need to know Patrick Henry, especially as an anti-federalist, and be able to quote him, especially maybe his speech from the Virginia Convention and the he spent 3 days at the Virginia Ratifying Convention saying why they shouldn't ratify the Constitution. He spoke for 3 freaking days straight. Talk about filibuster. That's all he did. So knowing him is important. So then you can use that as a reason why. The other thing is, James Madison, as soon as he got elected, wrote a letter to all the delegates proposing the New Jersey plan, or the Virginia plan. He was the founder of it. He wrote the letter. Edmund Randolph presented it for him, but he already set it out. They knew they were going there to get rid of the articles. Henry knew that as well. So that's also the reason why he could smell a rat. You need to know the rules that they set forth. That's important. That's an important aspect of this question. They set rules down that led to all the compromises taking place. Because in a question you could get in cross-ex is, should our current Senate and House of Representatives take on some of the same rules as members of the Philadelphia Convention? And that's something you need to really know. And then the slavery question, just make sure you're specific. Other reason why Northerners would say they won is the word slave is never actually used. It's implied. Because it's implied, it's not a pro-slavery document. But I think the rest of your arguments were good. Questions you guys have?